Hello, and welcome to another lesson from Level Up Mathematics. In today's lesson, we will be exploring real-world percent problems where we're asked to find the part. Now, we'll be doing this in two ways. We'll be using strip diagrams and percent proportion. So let's start with strip diagrams. So when we draw a strip diagram, we're going to draw a bar and let the whole rectangle stand for 100%. Then we'll split the strip into equal pieces. So if we split it into 10 equal pieces, then each part would represent 10%. If we split it into 4 pieces, then each part would equal 25%. So in our example here, it says use the strip diagram to find 75% of 24. So the entire bar is equal to 100%. And this particular strip diagram is divided into 4 equal parts. That means the first part is worth 25%. The first 2 parts would be 50%. 3 parts would be 75%. And all 4 parts would be 100%. What we know here is that the whole in this problem is 24. So 24 represents 100%. All right. So I know 50%, if I divide that in half, that would be 12. So 50% of 24 would be 12. 25% is half of 50%, and half of 12 is 6. So 6 is 25% of 24. Now, what they've asked us to find is 75% of 24. So I know that 25% plus 50% is 75%. So 6 plus 12 is 18. Therefore, 75% of 24 has to be equal to 18. All right. In example 1, it says use a strip diagram for each of the following. Now, to make this go a little bit quicker, I've already drawn the strip diagram and divided it into 10 pieces for us. And I've labeled each piece 10, 20, 30%, and so on. All right. So in problem A, they want us to find 50% of 500. So in all of the problems in example A, we're using 500 as our whole. So 100% is 500. So if I wanted 50%, I'm taking half of 100% is 50%, and half of 500 is 250. So 50% of 500 is 250. All right. Now, 10% of 500. So if I have 100% and I want to scale it to 10%, I would have to divide by 10. So 500 divided by 10 would be 50. Just move your decimal in one place. So 10% of 500 would be 50. All right. 1%. Now, 1% is not labeled on here, but I can draw it in. Let me put a 1%. So, to get from 10% to 1%, I would have to divide by 10. So, to get from 50 to the number we need, we would have to also divide it by 10. So, 50 divided by 10 gives me 5. So 1% of 500 is 5. So 2% of 500. Now, if 1% of 500 is 5, couldn't I just double 1%? So if I doubled 1%, I would get 2%. And if I doubled 5, I would get 10. So 2% of 500 is 10. All right, now I want 40%. So I'm going to scale one of these numbers. I'm going to pick anything that's easy to scale to 40%. So I'm going to use 10% again, and I want to scale that to 40%. So what would I have to scale 10% by to get for 40%? Well, I'd have to multiply by 4. So I'm going to have to do the same thing to the 50. And 50 times 4 is 200. So 40% of 500 is 200. Now, 42%. We already know 2% and we already know 40%. So 40% plus 2% is 42%. So I'm going to have to add up the 200 plus the 10 to get 210. So we're taking what we already know to find our new answer. All right, look at B. In problem B, our whole is going to be 250, represents 100%. So the first thing they want me to do is find 50% of 250. So if I take 100% and divide it by 2, I get 50%. And if I take 250 and divide it by 2, I get 125. So 50% of 250 gives me 125. Now, if I want 10%, I'm going from 100% to 10%. I must divide by 10. So that means I'm going to take the 250 and divide it by 10. And when I divide 250 but divided by 10, I get 25. So 10% of 250 is 25. So now they want 20%. So I'm just going to scale 10% because I could just multiply that by 2. So if I multiply the 10% by 2, I have to multiply the 25 by 2, and that would give me 50. So 20% of 250 is 50. All right. Now I want 2%. So 2% is down here. And I'm going to use the 20% to get to that. So 20% scaled to 2%, I would just divide by 10. So I must take 50 and divide it by 10, and that would give me 5. So 2% of 250 is 5. All right, now let's get 40%. So to get 40%, I'm going to use 20% to get to 40%. So 20 times 2 is 40. 50 times 2 would give me 100. So 40% of 250 is 100. So 42%, I would have to take the 40% and add the 2%. So 100 plus 5 would be 105. All right. Now, in our next set of problems, we're going to use our percent proportion to solve the word problems. So recall that a percent proportion is a special proportion which can be used to find a missing part, whole, or percent. And remember, our proportion is the percent over 100 equals part over whole. So in example A, it says, in a park, 40% of the trees change color in the fall. There are 500 trees in the park. How many trees in the park change color? So in this problem, we know the percent is 40. We know the whole is 500. We do not know the part. Okay, we're trying to find out how many of the 500 trees, that's the total, but how many of that 500 will change color? So we're going to say 40 over 100 is equal to X over 500. Now, what we want to do is look for a scale factor. So we know that we can multiply 100 times 5 to get 500. So if we can multiply 100 times 5 to get 500, we can also multiply the 40 times 5. And 40 times 5 is 200. So therefore, we know there are 200 trees which change colors. 40% of the trees change colors. So 200 trees in this park change color and 300 do not. All right. During a 90-minute school play, the main character was on stage 80% of the time. What amount of time in minutes was the main character on the stage? So we know the percent here is 80, and we know the whole play, the total amount of time in the play, was 90 minutes. What we're trying to do is determine the part. How long was the main character on the stage? Because he wasn't on stage for the entire 90 minutes. He was only on stage for 80% of the time. So our percent proportion would be 80 over 100 equals X over 90. Okay. Now, when we first look at this, we may think, this is not going to be very easy to find the scale factor. But if we were to reduce this fraction here, divide these both by 10, we would get 80 divided by 10 is 8. 100 divided by 10 is 10. Now we get a fraction that's much easier to scale, because 10 times 9 is 90. So we must multiply the 8 times 9. So X will equal 72 minutes. So the character will be on stage for 72 minutes. The main character will be on stage for 72 minutes. So sometimes when it's hard to find your scale factor, try and simplify one of your ratios to see if you can find the scale factor more easily. Okay. Problem C. Out of 850 people in an art museum, 32% have an annual pass. How many of the people had an annual pass? So we know our percent is 32. We know the whole is 850. What we don't know is the part. So 32 out of 100 is equal to X over 850. Now, in this problem, I'm seeing the scale factor pretty easy, because I know if I multiply 100 by 8.5, I will get 850. Likewise, if I were to multiply the numerator by 8.5, I could find the number of people that have an annual pass. So I'm going to take 32 and multiply that by 8.5. So 2 times 5 is 10, carry the 1, 15, 16, drop a 0. 8 times 2 is 16, carry the 1, 24, 25. So 0, 12, 1, 5, 6, 7, 2. Now remember, we had one number after the decimal, so we need to move our decimal in one place. And I know that X equals 272. So 272 people have an annual pass. 272 people have an annual pass. All right. Now, pause the video and try problem D on your own. When you're ready to check your answer, press play and see how you did. All right, welcome back. I set up my percent proportion as 65 over 100 equals X out of 120. I determined that my scale factor was 1.2, so I just multiplied the 65 by 1.2. So when I did that, and this is where most people make their mistakes, 5 times 2 is 10, carry the 1, that would be 13, drop the 0, 5, 6, 0, 8, 7. I have one number after my decimal, so I need to bring my decimal in one place. So X equals 78. So there are 78 pounds of copper. And that concludes today's lesson, finding the part.